Alright guys, so Omar Baddar recently made an appearance over on CNN with this host here, Frederica Whitfield, I think is her name, to discuss the latest Israeli massacre that we all saw unfold just a couple of days ago, where the IDF went into central Gaza during a hostage rescue operation where they ended up getting 4 hostages, and in the process of doing so, massacred hundreds of Palestinians who were in the surrounding area. So we're going to go ahead and jump into this clip. Honestly, I think he did such a good job that I'm shocked and surprised that CNN even allowed him on to this kind of a platform, but he's also going to discuss some of the latest on the seemingly failed Joe Biden ceasefire proposal that he insisted was Israel's proposal, and that Israel is repeatedly saying, no, that's not our proposal. So let's just go ahead and get into this interview and sort of work our way through it.
There's no question, whatever, I know there's some dispute about the specific numbers, but what unfolded yesterday was unquestionably a massacre. We have seen the images of the bodies of children littering the streets. We've seen the horrific scenes at the hospitals of weeping parents and bloody children. And to look at an incident of that scale, to see that many casualties, and to celebrate this as any kind of success, is effectively to say that the lives of Israelis are more valuable than the lives of Palestinians. That is the only way anybody can celebrate this as a success. Now, it's unsurprising that that's the view of the Israeli government. They've made it absolutely clear that they don't value Palestinian lives at all, not just throughout this campaign of assault on Gaza over the past several months, but Israeli policy towards Palestinians for much, much longer. What has been disappointing is the way our government also has reduced the massacre to a footnote and focused primarily on the retrieval of hostages. And Frederica, all you have to do is just imagine the reverse scenario. Right now, as we speak, there are thousands of Palestinians who have been kidnapped out of Gaza, placed in Israeli detention without any charge or trial. There's an article in the New York Times outlining the absolute horrific abuse they are undergoing on a daily basis. And if Hamas today were to carry out an incursion into Gaza, kill a couple of hundred Israelis, and then retrieve 4 Palestinians, would anyone in our discourse be celebrating this as some kind of victory? Would anyone even know the names of the 4 Palestinians who have been rescued from Israeli detention? We know the answer to that. And that's because we currently have a moment in which it's incredibly upsetting, the fact that we don't see Palestine.
Yeah, I mean, hard to argue with anything that he just said there. Yes, it absolutely was a massacre, and part of the context that, makes it especially that much more egregious is because there is a ceasefire proposal that is on the table that, again, Israel has been repeatedly rejecting that could return all of the hostages back to Israel in exchange for a permanent ceasefire. Benjamin Netanyahu, I think largely for his own personal, career reasons, doesn't want to end the war. He wants to expand the war. He wants to continue the war indefinitely. And so he's been the primary blockade to actually getting the hostages returned back to Israel. So even if that's your top priority, then your top priority should be trying to put pressure on Benjamin Netanyahu to accept a permanent ceasefire. That's the only surefire way to get the remaining living hostages back to Israel. In fact, through military means, even though they just managed to rescue 4 Israeli hostages in this recent operation, in a total sense, they've killed more of their hostages during these military operations than they have saved. So again, even if that's your top priority is the hostages, well, clearly this military strategy, this let's go carpet bomb the entirety of the Gaza Strip into oblivion strategy, is not exactly going to be successful in getting those hostages returned. It's going to pose a greater threat to them. Now, in terms of the analogy that he laid out there, of course, the media, of course, our politicians would never look at it in the same way if it was Palestinians or Hamas or any other Palestinian militant group that went into Israel to try to rescue Palestinians that, as he pointed out there, are being held largely without trial, without any due process, without being charged with anything, and are being subjected to torture. If a Palestinian militant group went to go rescue Palestinians living in those conditions, then nobody would turn around and say, oh yeah, it was perfectly fine that they went and massacred hundreds of Israeli civilians to go and get those Palestinians freed. Nobody would say that. They would say this was an egregious act of terrorism. They would say this was October 7th 2.0. That's how they would be talking about this. But the unfortunate reality is the basic view of most US media pundits and most of our politicians is we're the good guys, right? The US, our allies like Israel, we're the good guys. So when we do something, it's by definition good. And when they, the Palestinians or Hamas or whatever the case may be, when they do the exact same thing, then they're bad guys, right? It's a simple binary. It's a simple black and white that they view these kinds of things through. And as he pointed out there, the only possible way that you could view that recent Israeli hostage rescue mission as any sort of a success is if you simply do not value Palestinian life as equal to Israeli life. In fact, we could do the actual calculation and figure out that it's what? A trade-off of 100 Palestinians for one Israeli hostage? Is that the sort of ratio of Palestinians to Israelis that we think is acceptable to the U.S. or to the Israeli military for that matter? And another thing that he didn't mention there is that this is something that even the U.S. military would not have signed off on, right? We know the U.S. military has been responsible for countless war crimes throughout the last number of decades. We know all of that. But even the U.S. military would not have signed off on a hostage rescue mission, knowing that there could potentially be hundreds of civilians that are caught up in it and massacred, okay? So Israel is stooping even below, the U.S. military, which really is not a high bar to clear, but somehow they're doing it. So we continue with the rest of this.
When you hear the National Security Advisor Sullivan saying the preference is a ceasefire from this point forward, do you believe it's possible, and or do you believe that the release or rescue of more hostages can come without the cost of civilian lives?
Yeah, for Duque, it's even more than just civilian lives. The Israeli insistence on pursuing the release of hostages through purely military means has in fact killed far more Israeli hostages.
And by the way, that's not just his opinion, right? We know that Israeli hostages have been killed through the bombing raids. We also know that the military of Israel killed 3 of their own hostages who were waving white flags and speaking Hebrew at the time. And on top of that, we've also had the direct testimony of some of the hostages that have made it back to Israel, and they come out and say one of the main things that they were terrified of when they're being held hostage, which in and of itself should probably be the thing you're most scared of in that kind of a situation, is the fact that you're being held hostage. But they frequently cite the number one thing they were scared of was IDF bombing, that they thought their own government's military was going to bomb them, right?
There's no question that a ceasefire and an agreement to exchange hostages is the only path forward in which you can guarantee the safety both of Israelis and Palestinians out of all this. We've seen the biggest number of hostages being released the last time there was a temporary ceasefire in which we agreed for an exchange of hostages and prisoners between the two sides. And that is obviously the path forward. There is currently a deal on the table that basically says in exchange for the end of this war on Gaza that has just utterly devastated Gaza, killed nearly 40,000 people, in exchange for an end to that war, Israel can get all of its hostages back without another person being killed from this point moving forward. There's simply no reason not to accept that, except it seems that the Israeli government's goal of destroying Gaza seems to rank much higher than the lives of their own hostages, which is why we're stuck in this grotesque scenario. And it's why Netanyahu seems to be beholden to the fanatical wing of his own government, who are insisting that the ultimate goal has to be either the ethnic cleansing of Gaza or the permanent reoccupation of Gaza. And we're stuck in this situation where there is no real plan for what happens after this war. And in the meantime, people are going to continue to get killed. The fact that the United States, that President Biden clearly has some tensions with Netanyahu. Unfortunately, those tensions have not led to any real or meaningful pressure. The only way President Biden can actually change Netanyahu's behavior is by credibly threatening to withhold U.S. military funding for Israel. If Netanyahu does not change course, that unfortunately does not seem to be on the table. But I think Gantz is banking on that pressure ramping up moving forward and is trying to express a more clear and decisive disagreement with Netanyahu, hoping that when there is more mounting American and domestic Israeli pressure on Netanyahu, that he might potentially be there to essentially reap the benefits of that discontentment and take charge. But ultimately, really, we're stuck in a situation in which you need a ceasefire. That ceasefire can only be brought about through American meaningful pressure, and that has to mean that America cannot continue just providing unconditional military funding, knowing how these weapons are being used, knowing that...
Yeah, 100%. And honestly, we're well past the point of like, okay, let's put some conditions on the weapons that we're sending to Israel. At this point, we should be talking about full-blown sanctions on Israel. We should be talking about, trying to isolate them on the world stage in order to put pressure on them to not only end the current genocide in Gaza, but to end the occupation of Palestinians, to end the ongoing slow-rolling ethnic cleansing in the West Bank. Right? And under Benjamin Netanyahu, since October 7th, they've significantly ramped up the expansion of those illegal settlements. So the only way that anything is going to happen in regards to the oppression, the occupation of Palestinians, the end of this genocide, is if there is immense international pressure that is brought to bear on the government of Israel in order to get them to fall in line and to drastically change the structural foundations of the entirety of the state of Israel itself. We also, on top of, needing to apply that international pressure, we also should be, allowing for the ICC to issue these arrest warrants against Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant and plenty of other Israeli soldiers that you could go after that have been posting their own war crimes on TikTok and whatnot. I mean, we need to have actual accountability for these brazen war criminals. Benjamin Netanyahu is one of the most notorious war criminals now in modern history. And the US is coming out and talking about sanctioning the ICC for daring to try to go after him for intentionally starving the population of Gaza, which is something that they said they were going to do immediately after October 7th and then proceeded to do in broad daylight, right? So, I mean, obviously, the bare minimum at this point is an immediate unconditional ceasefire, right? As part of this ceasefire deal that the Joe Biden administration was floating around, it entailed an end to the war, right? We went through the whole stage process that Joe Biden tweeted out almost like a week ago at this point. And they started over time to sort of like change the parameters of that deal. And now they're talking about, okay, well, the deal obviously has to include the complete disillusionment of Hamas. And they're starting to add in things that I think they know that Hamas is not going to agree to or couldn't possibly be expected to agree to in this kind of a negotiation process. And so I really do think at the end of the day that this entire, confusion around the ceasefire that Joe Biden claimed was Israel's, and then Israel said, no, that's not our ceasefire in any way, shape, or form. I think the real reason that they're doing this is just kind of to provide an excuse to continue with what Israel is doing inside of Gaza and to deflect away and to say, well, don't come talking to us. Go talk to Hamas. They're the blockade to a ceasefire proposal. So a little bit more on that here. We had Antony Blinken, who was asked by another CNN anchor, I believe her name is Angela Mitchell or Andrea Mitchell, and she asked about Benjamin Netanyahu repeatedly coming out in public and saying he's not in favor of this Israeli deal, right, that Biden has been pushing for. And Blinken basically just completely bald-faced lied about it, straight to her face. So let's go ahead and watch a little bit of this clip here.
Unacceptable, as the National Security Advisor in Israel has said, to the end of the year, after such a horrific death toll in getting the hostages out militarily this weekend.
First, let me be very clear. Israel has accepted the proposal. In fact, they were critical in putting it forward. So the only party, no, that is what the official position of the Israeli government, the Prime Minister.
Really? Because you might want to inform him of that, right? This is the official position of the Israeli government. This is their proposal that they wanted to put out there. Then why didn't they put out there? Why did Joe Biden come out and announce an Israeli proposal that then was completely undercut by the government of Israel? I mean, in what world are we supposed to go along with this brazen gaslighting? That's what this is. This is just gaslighting. And it's almost like they're not even just trying to gaslight the American people. It's almost like they're trying to gaslight the government of Israel into thinking like, hey, was this actually our ceasefire proposal? I don't remember releasing this. Was this actually our deal that we were putting on the table? It's like they're just trying to gaslight their way into a ceasefire. And it makes absolutely no goddamn sense whatsoever. How are you going to look straight in this reporter's eyes and say, this is a deal that was put forward by Israel. This is a deal that is signed off on by the government of Israel and by the Prime Minister, when you also have reporting, directly coming out saying shit like this. I mean, here from Asal Rod, just from today. Israel vows to press on in Gaza after UN Security Council approves ceasefire proposal. So the US went to the United Nations Security Council, put this Biden ceasefire proposal on the table, and it passed. And I believe it passed unanimously. And immediately after that, you had Israeli officials coming out and saying, we completely disagree with this, right? We disavow this proposal. And this was a response here from Asal to Secretary of State Antony Blinken, who posted these side-by-side images of him shaking hands with Yoav Gallant and Benjamin Netanyahu. And he says, I met with the Israeli Prime Minister and Defense Minister to reiterate our commitment to the deal on the table, right? To secure the release of the hostages and surge humanitarian aid. So he's acting again as if these guys have both signed on to this deal. But then we get statements like this. I mean, this is the political coordinator for the Israeli representation at the United Nations. And immediately after this UN ceasefire proposal was put through, they say this: Israel stands firm on our principles, and they have not changed. We will continue until all of the hostages are returned and until the Hamas military and governing capabilities are dismantled. These have been our goals from day one. Just as President Biden stated on May 31st, Hamas must not stay in power. Israel will not let Hamas rearm or regroup so that Gaza can pose a threat to Israel. This is the unwavering goal that we are determined to achieve, yada, 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 right? So, I mean, they literally call this meaningless and endless negotiations. Meaningless and endless negotiations, right? What was the terminology they used a couple of days ago, right? They said this is a non-starter for us, this deal that Biden has put on the table and claimed as Israel's deal. So the gist of this entire statement is, once again, Israel is not willing to push forward with a deal that does not result, as a part of it, with the complete destruction of Hamas. That's their demand. Hamas has to be completely eradicated. So what are we doing here? Does that sound like a deal that Hamas is likely to accept? A deal that involves their own destruction? Is this how negotiations work? You got two sides, they come and they sit down at the table, and then one side says, okay, here's my initial and final offer. You will be destroyed. Does that sound like it's going to be a fruitful negotiation process? I mean, what are we supposed to take away from this gaslighting? I mean, just a couple more examples here, right? This is the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. She says today, the UN Security Council sent a clear message to Hamas. Accept the ceasefire deal on the table. Israel has already accepted this deal. I'd like to hear that from Israel, please. Because the only people I'm hearing that from are U.S. officials, not from Israeli officials. They say the fighting could stop today, and the hostages could come home today if Hamas agreed to the deal. Now, first off, we've had statements here from Hamas officials saying that they welcome the UN Security Council resolution for a Gaza ceasefire. So I've heard more from Hamas directly saying we're actually in favor of this Biden ceasefire proposal. I haven't heard a lick of that from top Israeli officials, but we've now heard it directly from Hamas officials. So they're seemingly in favor of this. They want to iron out the final details of the actual ceasefire proposal, and we just have Israel over and over again saying, no, we don't agree with this, right? And it's also false for Linda Thomas here to say that the fighting would stop immediately if there was a hostage deal. Benjamin Netanyahu has been saying for months, even if there was a deal to get all of the hostages returned back to Israel, that still would not result in an end to the war. They've been saying this over and over and over again. A hostage deal, regardless of how sweet of a deal it is on the Israeli side, will not lead to an end of the war. The only thing that they would accept as a valid end to the war is Hamas completely surrendering and completely giving up, right, to submit to who knows what. Israeli occupation, joint U.S.-Israeli occupation. Maybe you get the Saudis involved to help with some sort of a coalition occupation. What exactly is the plan for, even in a dream case scenario for the U.S., where Hamas does completely, abdicate power? What then? We also have, again, Anthony Blinken saying the same thing. If you want to alleviate the terrible suffering in Gaza, to put Israelis and Palestinians on the path to durable peace, press Hamas to say yes to the ceasefire. It looks like they already did. I mean, here from Biden again. Hamas says it wants a ceasefire. This is a deal and an opportunity to prove that they mean it. And then we get this. Hamas, again, welcomes UN Security Council resolution for a Gaza ceasefire. So, I mean, I don't know. You guys tell me. What is this? What is this? Is this not just the most insane gaslighting that you've ever seen in your entire life? It's almost, and somebody else made this point on Twitter, it's almost as if the entirety of the Biden administration right now is operating with the assumption that we don't have access to the internet, that we can't see the Israeli government repeatedly coming out and saying, we don't agree with this ceasefire. Are you guys unaware that we have access to that information, that we can look at their statements, we can look at their actions directly? Do you think we're just going to go along with this? It's like they're using the same, lying tactics and strategies that they would use 40 years ago or something. And back then, you didn't have the internet, you didn't have TikTok or Twitter or wherever else, and you kind of just had to trust what the nightly news or a newspaper was telling you, right? We don't live in that world anymore. We can see directly what they're saying, what they're doing, and we can see when it completely contradicts with the narrative that you're trying to outline. And that's exactly what this situation is. So I'll finish off the video there. Shout out to Omar for going on CNN. Not sure if this host was expecting him to just absolutely pop off like that, but he always does a great job, and always I think makes the case pretty well. So it's a pretty simple reality. If this is what the war is going to continue looking like moving forward, then we're just going to get more and more innocent Palestinians massacred, more and more Israeli hostages killed, all in service of what? So that Benjamin Netanyahu can escape jail so that he can keep himself in power? I mean, all of this is just completely insane.
Politic guy has the best politic. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me, everyone is saying